We're not meant to believe it. It's almost actually a gesture of power. It is, we can lie to you and there is nothing you can do about it.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that grenade fragments have been found in the victims of the plane crash that killed the Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin. 10 people were killed in the crash on the 23rd of August, 2 months to the day after Prigozhin had led a failed mutiny against the Kremlin. Mark Galeotti is a historian and specialist on Russian politics and security affairs. Mark, first of all, how likely is it that a plane carrying Prigozhin and a number of his colleagues was down by some sort of scuffle fight and grenade being set off in the cabin?
I mean, it's deeply implausible. And it's interesting that Putin even suggested that the people on the plane were either drunk or high on drugs and playing with hand grenades. Look, we know that Prigozhin, for all his numerous flaws, did run a very tight ship. He actually insisted on no alcohol on his private planes. The idea was flights were time to do work. And the thought that someone would accidentally, bring in, let alone play with a hand grenade at high altitude, it's exceedingly implausible. And in some ways, I think that is the point.
I was about to say, I mean, is this not the subtext here from Putin, which is, I'm gonna make some sort of farcical denial, but make it perfectly clear to the listening public that this was done on purpose, and that here's somebody that thought he could come for the king and who missed the king.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is very much on pattern for Putin. He has a tendency, precisely as you said, to have this sort of sly nod and a wink that says, "Look, I'm lying. You know I'm lying, but what can you do about it?" It's on the same sort of level as the Salisbury poisoners claiming to have been there simply to go and admire the spire on the cathedral. We're not meant to believe it. It's almost actually a gesture of power. It is, we can lie to you and there is nothing you can do about it.
Now, in terms of the fact that this is still making the news, the fact that he chose to raise it's that I think to me raises some questions. If the war was going better, if there was advances to talk about on the front line, it seems to me that this possibly wouldn't be something he'd be talking about in practically a chat show format.
Yes, exactly. I think it shows two things. One is that people are still worried about, as you said, the progress of the war. And this is another way of more or less sort of sidling up to the question of why are things going badly. But it also reflects the fact that although Prigozhin as a human being, such as he was not especially popular, the fact that he was someone who was willing to stand up to the Kremlin and, as people regard it, was willing to sort of tell it like it is, that actually was still very popular. And therefore, although I don't want to overplay it, there is a degree to which, by his assassination, Putin has turned Prigozhin into a kind of a martyr. So in some ways, I think, again, Putin, unfortunately, is likely to be dogged by the shadow of Prigozhin for some time to come.
Now, away from this element of the war, we've also seen, and we've heard in the news bulletins today, in fact, a catastrophic missile strike on civilians in a town in Kharkiv, based around a grocery store. I mean, can we say that this was a mistake, an error, or is this a target back on civilians in order to try and weaken morale?
It's very difficult to honestly answer that. I mean, the fact of the matter is, yes, of course, the Russians have from time to time carried out what can only be described as terror attacks, precisely to target morale. On the other hand, they have tended largely to focus, given that actually they are beginning to run low on the kind of precision munitions that they're using, on more strategic targets. And in this case, given that actually when we talk about precision, particularly when it comes to Russian missiles, that's not necessarily saying that much. It could easily turn out that this was actually just simply a tragic misdirection of a missile rather than anything else. But as I said, given that so many other things that the Russians have done, it's very hard to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Indeed, and in fact, I'm looking at the kind of the map here of where the fighting is, and I have to say, it really does look as if there's heavy weather being made of what 2 years on of what was supposed to be a 3-day war.
Yes, I mean, clearly that was never a runner. I mean, it was just based on Putin's complete misunderstanding of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And I think what we're now seeing is exactly it's sort of bedding down into an attritional phase, a sort of real sort of slow grinding struggle as the Ukrainians continue to try and push through the Russian defensive lines to the south, and the Russians essentially try and outlast the Ukrainians. Key thing is, though, as we start to head into winter, what we're likely to see is an upsurge precisely in these kind of Russian missile attacks, not so much aimed against direct civilian targets, but aimed against the energy infrastructure. In other words, basically trying to freeze the Ukrainians through the tough winter. So, it's a nasty, slow, grinding war, and it shows no signs of ending soon.
And just before I let you go, where do we see the next strategic pivot? Because we're going to have to see some movement before everything calms down again or settles down again for the winter. And we know that there is a regrouping that Russia is looking to do. Are they just desperately trying to cling on to what they have until that kind of winter shutdown happens?
Essentially, yes. Look, the Russians have no more operational offensive capability. They can launch very limited local counterattacks, but essentially, as you say, they're just digging in. And Putin, I think he more or less strategizes that he wins by not losing. Because the real pivot from the Russians' point of view is potentially political. Does the West begin to run out of weapons to provide the Ukrainians? Does it begin to lose the will and the unity to continue to support them? Now, I think that actually we're nowhere near that stage yet. But I think from Putin's point of view, that's his only real chance to be able to drag some kind of victory out of this. So the Ukrainians will just try and see how far they can push before the winter rains come. And the Russians, they just digging in and hanging on.